Thank you, Timor. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being with us this morning. So Timor gave you guys a quick physics lesson. Next 10 minutes, I'm going to give you a math lesson. And in 2011, my bosses who are sitting at table 7 threw us this challenge, and they asked us to estimate the GDP of Asia in the year 2020. And so back then, we put all our heads together and we came out with a number which should be appearing on this screen. And so that was our best answer in 2011. We estimated by the year 2020, Asia will be 22.4 trillion worth, slightly bigger than the US. And so we've done a little sort of peek to see whether we'll get the answer right. And so we're now issuing a revision. So our latest number stands at 20.5. And so if we were to get a grade on this, I would give ourselves an A minus, 92%. But like the typical Asian parent, never satisfied with a 92, right? So as we prepare for 2030, I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about how we can improve our prescience in trying to figure out what Asia would look like in 2030. But actually, these numbers mask a more important trend that's happened in the last 8 to 9 years, which is that at the start of the decade, Asia was roughly 25% smaller than the US. And by the end of this decade, the tables would have turned. And so even as we think about trade wars and we think about what's happening, this is a stark number. But this also gives us another very interesting lesson, which is that math doesn't lie. Numbers and data don't lie. And so as we frame our thoughts around what the future holds for Asia, we're just going to run through the numbers. So GDP is basically a function of these things: consumption plus investment plus government plus net exports. And so in order for us to think about what it would look like in 12 years, we've actually taken a shortcut. And the shortcut is to estimate two things: the population in the year 2030 for Asia, and how much will each person be earning in 12 years' time per income capita, per income per capita. Now, what we found in our last exercise is actually population is pretty much easy to ace, all right? So this part of the question is the easy one, because effectively, to estimate where we will be in 2030, we have to just know what the age distribution is right now, what life expectancy is, factor in other things like fertility rates, which don't move too dramatically, and barring a major nuclear fallout or barring a huge plague, the numbers will be what we pretty much think they will be. And so putting the numbers together on a spreadsheet, we basically estimate that Asia will have population, these are the 10 largest economies in Asia, will have an aggregate population of 3.5 billion. And that's an increase of 293 million, roughly the size of the entire United States added to Asia's population map. But there are a few other interesting features just to point out. One is that by the year 2022, India will exceed China and become the most populous nation in the world. And so this kind of speaks about kind of the whole demographic situation. But if we think about economics, then what's relevant is working age population. And on this front, what we do see is that India will see an increase of 167 million. That's a huge number to its working age population, whereas China will see a decrease of 125 million. And so this is an important number to bear in mind as we just think about the dynamics of population. The harder question actually that we have found, and this is mostly what we got wrong as we analyze our assumptions in 2011 for 2020, is income growth. And so this is our scorecard, and we actually were overly bullish perhaps on Singapore, Taiwan. We were just coming out of the global financial crisis. There was a big V-shaped jump, and we were probably sort of too optimistic on some of those economies. But fortunately for us, the Pareto rule worked in our favor. And so for the larger economies, in particular China, Korea, Indonesia, and to some extent India, we were much closer to the mark. And so this kind of gives us another sort of tip on how to ace this exam, which is the Pareto rule. If we basically get India, China, perhaps Indonesia right, we pretty much get the whole region right. And so that brings me to this point about what do we expect income growth to be. So, we can't really predict the future, but what we're going to spend the rest of this time doing is anchoring our thinking around what will drive income growth in the various economies of Asia over the next 10, 12 years. And so this is our baseline, and we basically have the more developed economies roughly at about 1 to 2%, still a bit more bullish on Taiwan. But if we look at the larger developing economies and emerging economies in Asia, we're looking at roughly 3.5% to 4% for China and India, and around that for the other ASEAN economies. And so this is the number, but what I wanted to spend the next 4 minutes doing is actually helping to frame our thinking around this particular metric by looking at Asia through the lens of 4 prisms. And so these prisms are as follows. The biggest trend that we have going on is urbanization. I'll talk a bit more about that. The second is an idea that is known as Industry 4.0, or the fourth industrial revolution, the rise of the Asian middle class consumer, and finally Asian connectivity. So our very first thing that we want to think about is urbanization. Now, the idea here is actually really simple. Think of a farmer somewhere in Indonesia or in India or in China who moves from his farm to the city, gets a job in a factory. What does that mean? Income growth. Spends time in a factory, eventually he becomes or she becomes a masseuse or hairdresser or spa therapist or a Grab or an Uber driver, and suddenly income goes up. So they move from manufacturing to services, room for income growth. And then, of course, as education increases, they move into higher value-added jobs, income growth. And so that's the reason why cities effectively account for 85% of the world GDP. Highest incomes are earned as people move from the villages into cities and get better, higher-paying jobs. So what does that mean for Asia? Well, for Asia, the staggering number is that by the year 2040, Asia would have added 1 billion people to its cities. So the urban population would have gone from 2.1 to 3.1 billion. Stop for a moment and think about 1 billion. 1 billion homes, possibly 1 billion more cars, 1 billion more TV sets, 1 billion more handphones, internet accounts. That's a staggering number. Now, the other interesting point is that when we think of Asian urbanization, we think of mega cities, and there will be 22 mega cities. We think of huge metropolises like Mumbai or Shanghai. But the reality is that 90% of the urban population in Asia will actually be in small and medium-sized cities. And so that's another interesting thought, that instead of seeing a huge urban sprawl, if urbanization is spread out across a huge number of small and medium-sized cities, that's another interesting possibility to think about. Okay, so now they move to the cities, they get jobs. This is the other interesting dynamic that is basically happening, which is what we call the fourth industrial revolution. First industrial revolution was invention of the steam engine and mechanization. The second was assembly line production with the Ford Model T. The third was really the use of automation. But this fourth industrial revolution is an interesting mix of 3 things coming together. It's a mix of digital, physical, and biological spheres coming together to create a whole new industrialization paradigm. And the interesting thing that we have to think about is as Asia pursues an industrialization strategy, and as they have the opportunity to leapfrog the third industrial revolution and move straight to the fourth industrial revolution, what impact does this have on incomes? And so as the Asian income pie grows, it brings us to the third prism, which is consumption. And so think about it for a moment. Now, again, a staggering statistic. Between now, 2015 and the year 2030, Asia would have added 1.5 billion to the middle class ranks. By 2030, Asia will account for 2 out of every 3 in the global middle class. Again, stop and think about what that means. Just from a business perspective, from a sustainability perspective, 1.5 billion more Asians wanting to consume higher protein in their diets, wanting a better quality of life. And this is a very powerful thing. So, if you stop and think about it, I call this the great Asian land grab over the next 12 years. Whoever can develop a powerful Asian brand, whoever can leverage new technology to disrupt the current way services are being distributed and performed, wins this land grab. The final piece of the puzzle is basically the connectivity idea. And here, I think the very simple idea is this, right? As borders within Asia come down, as trade of products, of services, the flow of goods and capital moves seamlessly across Asia, what does this add to the whole growth dynamic for the region? And add to that the fact that as the world becomes more insular, more protectionist, would this hasten the pace of integration among Asian economies? And so that's our 4 prisms that we look through. And so with that, ladies and gentlemen, I want to officially announce that this is our forecast for Asia 2030, 28.3 trillion by the year 2030. By then, as you can see, it will be roughly a third larger than the US. It would have essentially added an entire Eurozone. $11 trillion, an entire Eurozone economy gets added to Asia's economic landscape over the next 12 years. But what does this number mean? So what if it's 11 trillion more? So what if it's 28.3 trillion? The answer to everyone in this audience today is, if there is this opportunity over the next 12 years, what are you going to do as owners, as managers of your business, to build a brand that can exponentially reach the masses of new middle-class consumers in Asia? What will you do to position your companies to invest in new technologies that will allow you to scale your businesses to tap this opportunity? And the same question then will be on investors' minds. Which are the firms that will lead the charge to own the brands in Asia that will redefine the scope of business? That's where you should be putting your money. And so with that, ladies and gentlemen, is a quick math lesson on the economics of growth in Asia to the year 2030. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Timothy. Thank you for those insights, for those trends, some very unexpected numbers there, quite staggering. And thank you also to Timor, appreciate that. And I have to say, you can never do a power